Yeah. Yes. Micah knows the way if you need to get things plugged in. That's if you can't figure it out, find someone 20 years younger than you, and they will.
I think it's 84 miles from Cyprus. My heavy foot.
All right. And I've got the full hour, right? Just let me know when you want me to go.
Yeah, we're all ready to go. Ready? Okay. We call you Commissioner Steve.
You can call me whatever you'd like. Call me Brian, actually, would be the appropriate thing.
Well, hey, thanks for taking your time.
Absolutely.
Come up and share some information and kind of keep us abreast and updated. And I know we've got several people that something about water.
Something about water.
Something about water. But I know they have a lot to do with it, and we appreciate your attendance here today. And water,
Okay.
Water District representative, I'm sure you're aware.
Oh, I'm aware of these people.
And I hope you are.
Yeah.
But we'll turn it over to you, kind of educate us and
Great.
get us up to speed.
All right.
Speed there.
So, by way of introduction, my name is Brian Steed. I have two roles. The role I put up here is the executive director of the USU Janet Quinney Lawson Institute for Land, Water, and Air. That's one of my day jobs. The other, as was mentioned, I'm the commissioner of the Great Salt Lake. I have read the information you provided to the state engineer. Mike was kind enough to send that along. Rather than get into the ins and outs of that, at the beginning, I'm going to go through a broader overview of water in the state of Utah and kind of contextualize where you are here in Cache County, and I guess where we are because I live here. I'm a Cache County kid. I grew up in Logan and lived here the majority of my life, so it's good to be here. And I went to school with Commissioner Ward's daughter, and I saw her at Lagoon the other day. So
Well, she was down there, huh?
yeah.
Okay.
So, anyways, it's nice to be back. Let's talk about this generally. First of all, just three things we're talking about is first of all the Great Salt Lake, and I'm going to do this kind of in general terms of where the water basins are in the state. The one that you hear about all the time and the one in which we're in is the Great Salt Lake watershed, and I'm going to go through a few things about why you might want to care about the Great Salt Lake. And it's a little different than some of the things that we've talked about generally in the media. But I'm going to talk specifically about the regulatory concerns that you may just be aware of and that I think all of us need to be mindful of as we make decisions going forward. So I'm going to talk about a couple of federal regulatory concerns as well as a couple of state regulatory concerns just to be aware of. Great Salt Lake, just as by way of an overview, this is a graphic presented by our friends at Google Earth Engine, and you'll notice that over time it starts at the high water mark back in the mid-1980s and continues down to where we hit the low water mark last year in 22. If we were to continue that on to current, you'd see a little more of that fluctuation where it comes back up, and so it's not all bad. And interestingly, you would see more of the fluctuation. It come back up on the south side. On the north side, you wouldn't see that. As you might be aware on the Great Salt Lake generally, it's really two separate bodies of water. And you can see that faint white line in the middle, and then you see different colors of water on the north arm and south arm. The north arm is biologically dead. It is hypersaline, and so salty that the only thing that lives there are very robust bacteria. Sometimes they change the lake to kind of a bright pink color, which is kind of interesting. So when we talk about saving the ecological viability of the lake, we're really talking about that south arm, which by and large is where all of the fresh water runs into, including the Bear River. Let's talk about the Goldilocks problem with salinity. So saline lakes are salty. We know the Great Salt Lake is named the Great Salt Lake because, well, it's salty. It's one of the reasons when Jim Bridger was flowing down the Bear and he ended up in the Great Salt Lake, he figured he'd reach the ocean. Well, surprise, he didn't. He actually ended up in a big inland sea. And that big inland sea has been declining since really Lake Bonneville times. Lake Bonneville burst and flowed north, and then you've got this big body of water. It's a terminal lake, which water goes in and stays there. And if it doesn't get a fresh inflow, it gets saltier and saltier. So the north arm has become saltier and saltier because it hasn't had that inflow of fresh water. The reason it hasn't had that inflow of fresh water is there's a causeway berm that goes across. That faint white line, that's the Union Pacific Railway causeway that goes across, and it has really separated out into two bodies of water. Last year, when we were looking at salinity levels reached about 18.5%. And why we got concerned about that is because brine shrimp, the things that people may be familiar with on that south arm, those cute little guys on the left, really thrive at a 6 to 10% level of salinity, and at 21% salinity, they're all dead. All of them are dead. There's no reproduction, and it just goes into something we see similar to what's on the north arm. Animals rely on brine shrimp and brine flies. And so there's another complicated ecosystem there that has what they call microbialite mats. Those microbialite mats in exchange with brine fly larvae, and you'll see that that's our state bird, which is named the California seagull, which I wish we didn't have a state bird named after another state, but I didn't choose it. But nonetheless, you see it thriving on those brine flies. So they're not the only ones, though, that rely on that, and there's a lot of other animals that rely on this. On the left, there's an animal called the eared grebe, and on the right is a bird called the Wilson's phalarope. Wilson's phalaropes rely on brine fly and brine fly larvae. Eared grebes rely on brine shrimp. In fact, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of eared grebes arrive on the lake. They molt, they lose their feathers, and they thrive on those brine shrimp while they regain their feathers. If the brine shrimp go away, well then you have millions of birds on the Great Salt Lake that slowly starve to death, and that will make the papers. And you say, well, why are we doing this? Why do we care? Well, it turns out that the federal government cares quite a lot about species and how they survive. And if you look back in 1973, our nation's most environmental president, Richard Nixon, created or signed into law the Endangered Species Act. And as part of the Endangered Species Act, decided Congress and the President that it is further declared to be the policy of Congress that all federal departments and agencies shall seek to conserve endangered species and threatened species and shall utilize their authorities in furtherance of the purposes of this act. It's further declared to be the policy of Congress that the federal agencies shall cooperate with state and local agencies to resolve water resource issues in concert with conservation of endangered species. And that's a lot of legalese. People said, well, what does that mean? A few years after that, TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, is building a very large dam. And they're the folks that electrified the South, right? And they're building a dam called the Talico Dam, and lo and behold, they'd put about $1 billion, maybe a little north of that, into the dam, and they found a fish called the snail darter, and that snail darter, they said, well, this is an endangered species, we can't go forward with this project. And TVA said, nah, that's ridiculous. We've put over $1 billion in and we're electrifying the South, this can't be what you really meant. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the law of the land, as it stands, the TVA v. Hill, the U.S. Supreme Court says, one would be hard-pressed to find a statutory provision whose terms were any plainer than those in Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. Its very words affirmatively command all federal agencies, quote, to ensure that actions authorized, funded, or carried out by them do not jeopardize the continued existence of an endangered species or result in the destruction or modification of habitat of such species. This language admits of no exception. And you say, well, what does that mean to me? Well, it means if you get a listed species under the Endangered Species Act, that there is no exception to that rule, that we then put all the resources into protecting that species. And that's going to be the priority of the United States. In a water context, you say, yeah, but so what? Well, I'll tell you so what. In Klamath River, they had endangered species that were listed, 2 fish species and some other stuff. Agricultural interests are often pitted against the needs of tribes and endangered species in a more recent article, so I'm not going to read all of it. Farmers needed 400,000 acre feet. In fact, had rights to 400,000 acre feet of water. The Army Corps, actually it was the Bureau of Reclamation in this case, delivered, let's see, how much? 33,000 acre feet of water. And I'm not great at math, but having rights to 400,000 acre feet and only being delivered 33,000 acre feet, that's a big difference. And in fact, it got to the point where they actually stopped delivering water to Crater Lake National Park. They had to truck in water. And so it went into kind of the theater of the absurd to where this happened. Why we care about that is this. Those 2 species, those things, eared grebes and Wilson's phalarope, have both been discussed as potential candidate species for listing under the Endangered Species Act. If that happens, we are no different than what's happened in the Klamath case. And that's something I think all of us need to be aware of. So that could put a full stop on all new water developments and actually could also put a full stop to existing water uses. It all gets reprioritized. We have flows to the lake in a way that we have no control over, and that's something I think that concerns us all from a policy perspective. Other ESA cases, just so you're aware, that beautiful fish species on the left is a humpback chub in the Colorado. We release a lot of water every single year in the Colorado River in order to preserve flows that are beneficial to the humpback chub. We wash other fish species down the river in order to provide breeding areas for this, and that means we actually lose water from the upper part of the Colorado that goes to the lower part of the Colorado and is accessed by other states.
In Vegas and LA, and they
All of that.
they say thank you.
They do say thank you. They do, and so does the fish. But that's the issue. Closer to home, we have that beautiful fish on the right, on the top right. Do you guys know what that is? That's the June sucker. The June sucker inhabits, it actually inhabits ponds just to the west of here, because that's where DWR breeds them as their brood stock. But then they put them all in Utah Lake. Utah Lake, part of one of the things that's been so hard to clean up Utah Lake is they've been preserving habitat for the June sucker. It's been a real issue for them. The little mammal there on the bottom left, you know what that is? That's the Utah prairie dog, a species endemic to Utah. I worked on that as a deputy county attorney in Iron County, Utah some years ago, and it cost millions of dollars per year in managing the species, as well as prohibited Iron County from growing in substantial ways. I mean, it put a moratorium on growth. You had to only have as many building permits as were allowed under the take rules for the Endangered Species Act, and it became quite a thing. It is still quite a thing. That species was actually downlisted from endangered to threatened, but still the same rules apply. So that's what they're dealing with in Iron County and parts of Garfield County. And then further away back to California, we have that beautiful 2-inch fish right there. You guys know what that is? That's called the Delta smelt. And the Delta smelt is a 2-inch fish that apparently smells like cucumbers. I haven't had the opportunity to smell it, but that's kind of interesting. And that fish inhabits the San Joaquin Bay Delta near San Francisco. It's where the source of the California Water Project is. For many years now, they haven't operated those pumps at full extent because they're protecting this species here. Meaning that we have caused drought conditions, human-caused drought conditions, for much of California to save that fish. So just be aware that that's real, that's out there, and that's something that I think that we all need to be concerned about. Secondly, you've heard about this, is the dust problem. As the lake has shrunk in size, you'll see we have a bunch of more exposed lake bed. That exposed lake bed weathers over time, and eventually you have dust that's kicked up. And you say, yeah, but who cares? Well, it turns out that has direct impact on your snowpack. A recent study out of the University of Utah, in 2022, Alta's snow melted 17 days earlier. Dust will travel into Cache Valley as well, although not as much as it does just based on prevailing winds into the Salt Lake area. But nonetheless, that's something that should be alarming, but that's not why we should be most alarmed. Most alarmed, I think, again, goes to the federal statutes that surround this and the Clean Air Act, again passed by the environmentalist Richard Nixon, that you'll find that this law says that we're going to set national ambient air quality standards. Some of those national ambient air quality standards include what they call particulate matter at 2.5 microns and again at 10 microns. I know it's crazy boring, but what happens is if we have too much of those things in the air, we are deemed to be in non-attainment. And if we're deemed to be in non-attainment, there are restrictions that get put into place. Those restrictions also will impact our growth abilities, the same as if we're just in an impaired airshed. The other thing is people do care about dust and are generally concerned about the health effects that might cause. Other things that we're just monitoring, just so you're aware, other cases like the Great Salt Lake have had state rules put into effect. California has enacted the public trust doctrine in order to protect Mono Lake, which is the terminal lake in California. That's something, again, that put a state court in charge of getting water to the lake. That state court has never given up jurisdiction of that, and that's something that also gives me shivers. And last but not least, as you're aware, this can end up having a state regulatory environment just based on state law. So last year we had Governor Cox sign a proclamation suspending new water diversions in the Great Salt Lake Basin, and that's something that I know that you're all concerned about here. So I'm just saying that the lake, yes, is important. It's a gem, it's great. But I think that what should be more alarming than the lake's decline for all of us is the regulatory effects that might come to fruition if we don't get it right. And that's something in my role as Great Salt Lake Commissioner that I'm working very hard to make sure that we get right so that we have control of our own future rather than being mandated by a state court or a federal regulatory agency on the direction we have to take as a state, because I think that we all lose oftentimes under those scenarios. So question, why is the Great Salt Lake shrinking? I think that's a really important question. We've been looking at that on the Great Salt Lake the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. We created a policy assessment last year. It's a collaboration with us and the U, as well as DNR, UDAF, and DEQ. Some data insights. You can see that over the historical record of the lake, there's been ups and downs. Those are the means of lake levels on a yearly basis, really going back to 1900. If you continue this record back in time to 1847, when they started keeping it, you would see that same trend of ups and downs. But what you're seeing in the contemporary trend is downs and then more downs. We say, well, why is that? Well, gosh, one of the things we would look at is precipitation. And if you look at the precipitation averages, you actually don't see a statistically significant trend. You see a lot of noise, a lot of times where we have a little water, a lot of times we have a lot of water, but you see a relatively flat line on that, even in the contemporary period. What you do see in the contemporary period is those larger troughs at the bottom, but it's not like we're receiving a substantially amount of less water. We are seeing an increase in temperature. That's something that we're aware of because that means more evaporative loss. As you turn up temperature on your stove, for instance, you would expect to see more water evaporate out of your stove. You're seeing the same thing on the Great Salt Lake. And then look at stream flows. So if you look at stream flows over time, this is again tracking the Bear River, which is the largest inflow into the Great Salt Lake. You're seeing a declining trend line there from 1903 to 2022. You see a bump up in 2023, obviously, because we had the great winter that we had, but just be aware that that trend line has been down. That trend line is on its way down based on human diversions. Weber River stream flow, same thing, where you see that trend line down because of stream flow or because of human diversions. And then the Jordan River, you see a little less of that diversion. I'm sorry, a little less of that downward slope because back in the 1970s and 80s, we actually started to divert part of the Colorado down the Jordan River system as part of the Colorado River Project. So but it's still a downward trend. Where does that water go? Human depletion. Largest is ag. Second largest is human, municipal, and industrial use. And then the third which is interesting, is managed wetlands. As the wetlands have become further away from where the body of water is, it takes more water to keep those wetlands wet. And so it takes more water loss as a result. And you can go down through that list where you've got GSL mineral extraction as well as reservoirs rounding those things out. Looking forward, best guess, if we say, listen, let's say the trends continue, what we would expect to see, you would expect to see actually a little more moisture, which is great news. You'd also expect to see a little more heat, which eats up that moisture, and so we don't necessarily have an increase in the lake. So what does that all mean? Well, it means we probably need to get as much water to the lake as possible and keep it there. In order to do that, we're going to have to make some choices on how to get it there. And this is just a number of scenarios that we went through on how to keep it at a certain level. Each of those lake levels have certain benefits and costs associated with them. The lake elevation has different benefits. As it gets higher, it eventually gets too high and we start flooding out I-80 and the railroad again, like we saw when we installed pumps in the desert. If it gets too low, we see those adverse effects with salinity and dust and other negative effects that people just don't like to see. So that's broad overview on Great Salt Lake, okay? Do you guys want to ask questions on Great Salt Lake before we pivot to two other, and I'll be much quicker on this, and then we'll get into questions. All right? You okay with that?
Okay.
All right, Colorado River. I think we have to talk about this because if you look at the other source of water in Utah, it's the Colorado River. It is the water of the West. 40 million people rely on the Colorado. We don't rely that much here in this area on the Colorado River because most of that water goes to areas on the Wasatch Front as we use it, as well as areas along the Colorado River for the duration of its stay in Utah. In 1922, they had a problem, and this is. I love this picture because look how happy everyone is. Just such pleased people, such a happy-looking bunch. They had a problem. California was growing, and California was at the end of the river. And they said, well, if California starts developing their river water rights first, or better said, if they develop water rights at all on the river first, we in the West believe in first in time, first in right. If California gets there first, there was the real possibility that the entirety of the river would be dedicated to California's uses. And in 1922, the president saw this, and it wasn't Herbert Hoover at the time, but he appointed Herbert Hoover to lead this commission. Herbert Hoover brought the 7 states together that rely on the Colorado and said, what are we going to do about this? And they came up with some solutions. They came up with what they call the Colorado River Compact, and it divided into the north and the south. The north, or the upper basin, consists of Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The south consists of California, Nevada, and Arizona, although, 2 caveats. There's a portion of the lower basin in Utah, this is the Virgin River drainage, and there is a portion of the upper basin in Arizona, which is along the Arizona Strip of Arizona. But by and large, this holds out. They said, well, how are we going to divide the waters? Well, then, we know exactly how we'll do this. The lower basin was smart, and they said, yeah, well, we got to guarantee that we have a flow that comes here, and so we really think there's about 17 million acre-feet flowing. We think we should divide that essentially halvesies, but we're going to be conservative, and so we're going to say there's about 15 million acre-feet flowing, and that 15 million acre-feet flowing, well, we're going to guarantee 7.5 million acre-feet get to the lower basin. So that's a guaranteed flow right? We're going to guarantee 7.5 million acre-feet gets there. The upper basin, well, they get the remaining 7.5 million acre-feet. But, and they also went on to say, well, how are we going to divide this out? In the lower basin, we decided, well, California, they were here first, so they get the first and biggest cut of 4.4 million acre-feet per year. Arizona gets the second biggest cut of 2.8 million acre-feet, and then Nevada gets 300,000 acre-feet because no one lived in Nevada in 1922. So then it goes to the upper basin, and in the 1940s, they come back and say, well, how are we going to divide this up? And they say, well, gosh, rather than divide out that 7.5 on a firm number, we're going to have percentages of whatever is not sent to the lower basin, right? So the 7.5, and so we divided that out. and said Colorado had the largest population, so 51% goes to Colorado. New Mexico, not very many people, 11%. Utah, more people, second largest, so 23%. And Wyoming gets 14%. So think about this and say, well, gosh, if it is flowing at 15 million acre feet per year, and Utah gets, and the upper basin gets 7.5, Utah is entitled about 1.4 million acre feet, right? That all sounds great, but two problems they hadn't considered. One, there was another country on the mix. The Colorado River flows into Mexico, and eventually Mexico came back and said, you know what, we probably need some water too. And so years later, they agreed that Mexico gets at least 3 million acre feet from the Colorado. No one has decided for whose share that comes, but that's a problem. This is actually a picture from the Colorado River Bay Delta in Mexico, and you can see it's been dry for some time. And then the bigger problem in the Colorado system has been flow. When you look at actually where they adjudicated this back in the 1920s, you see lots of water. By the time you see it in 2020, in those years, you see less water. And in fact, rather than have the established norm of about 15 million acre feet that we thought was there, it's really been flowing around 12, maybe even lower than that, 12 million acre feet. Keep in mind that the lower basin is still guaranteed by contract that full 7.5 million acre feet, which remains only now 4.5 million acre feet for the upper basin to utilize. That scares a lot of us. And then you've got to add into that, who gives Mexico their water? Where does that come from? So if you divide that equitably, 8.75 million acre feet from the lower basin, and then that whatever's left behind minus about 1.5 million acre feet would be where it's at, okay? Anyways, I know this is super boring, but what's the problem? Well, again, we have consumptive uses that are on the rise in Utah. Agriculture is the biggest user. The second biggest user is those trans-basin diversions for municipal and industrial use along the Wasatch Front. And then way down the list is evaporation and municipal and industrial along the river itself. And when I talk about from those areas way across, like I mentioned, we divert a fair amount of the Colorado River, of Utah's allocation of the Colorado River to the Wasatch Front through the Central Utah Project. And that's what you see here, where it flows through a variety of natural rivers as well as some bypasses and eventually ends up in Utah Lake. And then from Utah Lake, it actually feeds into Salt Lake and goes almost all the way to the North Salt Lake, if you want to know the geographic basin.
That was actually supposed to be a lot more extensive.
It was. In fact, you'll notice this is a graphic from the Central Utah Project Completion Act, CUPCA, because they have never completed it all the way and they're still pushing for that. So yeah, that's right. That's
Central Utah are really mad about it.
They're very mad.
Yeah.
Yep. I didn't want to leave anything out, so I want to talk about Sevier Basin, the Cedar Beaver Basin, because I think that this is meaningful. You'll notice that everything else flows somewhere else. So West Colorado, Southeast Colorado, Uinta Basin, all of those flow into the Colorado drainage. Utah Lake Basin, Jordan River Basin, Weber Basin, Bear River Basin, and West Desert Basin all flow into the area of the Great Salt Lake. And the Virgin River, Kanab Creek Basin, that all flows into the Colorado as well, because it eventually meets up with Lake Mead and then eventually into the Colorado River. So that leaves those two basins, the Sevier and the Cedar Beaver Basin. Let's talk about those. Turns out even there, they have not been free of debate. So the Sevier River really has this kind of upside down J, okay? It flows north, up, and into a dry lake bed called Sevier Lake up south of Delta. So that upside down J, there is always fights between the lower Sevier and the upper Sevier. The lower Sevier, we're geographically is to the north. The upper Sevier is geographically to the south, but that's because it's high ority to low ority from where the water flows. And there's always that debate. And currently there's litigation between Cedar and Beaver, between actually Beaver County and Iron County, because Iron County acquired water rights that technically are in the area of Beaver County, Beaver, even though the water rights are legally obtained, Cedar went out and checked the boxes, and it's been to the court a few times. Beaver says we're getting robbed, and we're getting robbed of our birthright. So just be aware that water debates happen everywhere, even in terminal areas, and even in terminal areas that are not connected to other big areas of concern. You just got to watch for water use policy. This is actually, I worked as a deputy county attorney in Iron County right after I graduated from law school, and I lived in Enoch. At the time, I had a guy in my neighborhood. We actually eventually sold our house to this guy that was developing a new residential subdivision. And the residential subdivision went right off Half Mile Road, and they actually built it, put the sewer lines in, put the roads in, and then this happened. Do you guys know why that happened? Well, they actually pumped so much groundwater that they caused what they call surface subsidence. So the surface subsidence, groundwater keeps the surface afloat. You pump that groundwater out, and it starts to compress. And as it compressed in the area of this subdivision. And the one home they had a spec home built, and the sewer started to flow backwards into the house. And I don't know if you know much about that, but that's generally not the preferred course of flow. And so this county had to take the action of coming in and condemning that property. And that entire subdivision now is done because they have this problem, and that's actually the road they put in. It was actually a beautiful subdivision. My wife and I, had we stayed, we probably would have bought and built there, but it just is a complete mess now. Where we lived is a place called Half Mile Road. That Half Mile Road is now a source of concealed flooding, probably flooding because they've created a bit of an artificial basin underneath there, and so when there's big rainstorms, that water congregates and floods all of our neighbors in that area, which is sad. And similarly, water quality is a concern other places as well, and this is the case of Monroe, Utah, which is just south of Richfield, if you know where that is. The light green in that area is the groundwater basin because they're based almost entirely on groundwater. That's the area of groundwater basins contaminated by agricultural uses. The red, well, that's contamination from septic systems because they don't have a sewer there, and so they have more groundwater recharge from their septic systems than from natural systems. And that's causing a big increase in nitrates and phosphates in those areas and making the groundwater that people are pumping for their homes unsafe to use. And the blue, well, that's a combination of both agriculture and septic system wastes. And I guess the take-home tale of that is that even if you're not connected to a bigger system, if you don't manage the water resources right, you end up with potential problems of those resources. And that's a case that's ongoing. No one has a great answer because it's going to be extraordinarily expensive to connect sewer out to those houses now, and it's going to be something that we work on. So rather than leave you with the sense that nothing can be done, we've been working to say, well, what are the options we got? And there's a lot of things that you can do. One of the policy options you can do, well, let's go through some of the problems first. First of all policy options have benefits and trade-offs. There's no single silver bullet. There are many pieces to the puzzle, and as was mentioned, there's many water problems in the state. And some people say, well, let's go get Idaho's water, or let's go get, if Idaho were here presenting, Idaho would present this list of horribles as well, saying we're struggling with our own problems, hands off our water. And you'd have that same kind of debate. So one thing that's been floated is limiting municipal and industrial water growth. Notice I didn't say limit growth. I don't think there's any mechanism by which you can say we're just not going to have people move in. I mean, I grew up here. I came back here. My parents were living here. It's where I wanted to live. And quite candidly, it's my favorite place on the planet. I want my kids to have the option to grow up here. And so I very much understand that we can't necessarily say no more growth. What we can do is put policies in place to say limit how water is used in those areas, and that's something that's a hard conversation. I'm glad in those instances that I'm not in your shoes, because I've noticed that people care loudly about water, and they care loudly about, when you talk about water and growth, it becomes something very passionate to people. But nonetheless, it's something I think that we got to be aware of. One of the things that we've been examining is the possibility of water neutral growth, to where you say, listen, we have a set amount of water, we're going to decide to grow our community using the water that we currently have. It's harder to do, it's more expensive, but you can certainly balance that out. You can have increased depletions in M&I growth, and then you can have reduced depletions on existing M&I uses, and you can do both of those things. On existing depletions from M&I uses, for instance, all of us have grass strips. I have a grass strip in front of my house, and the park strip. I have tried for a year. Well, I've only been in my house for about a year now. I've tried for the entire year to water the sidewalk on either side of it. So the road on one side of the sidewalk, it's never grown. The pavement hasn't grown. That's something that we can actually take more seriously and reduce, and that's something where you could have actual water savings without having real beautification losses or that cooling effect loss that people worry about when you take out sod. Those are the kind of conversations we're going to have to start talking about.
There was to where municipal ordinances that, hey, you had to have
That's
that.
exactly right. And so it's something I think that we're learning.
But
Yeah.
they're all changing.
I think that's right. And then similarly, you can have, lower flowing toilets. You can have, one of the things that's my pet peeve is that sometimes when you put businesses in, there are requirements to have landscaping around that will never be used for anything, right? And that's something that we probably can do better on as a society. So that's one thing. Two, we have to have a serious conversation about agricultural water optimization. Research at Utah State, my colleague Matt Yost, shows that you can actually save up to 15% just by changing the technology by which you water, right? So everyone knows pivot systems. If you have different adaptations on the heads of those pivot systems, you can actually have more efficient water uses. You can reduce your water use without costing any crops, and save about 15% of the water. If we were to do that system-wide, that's actually pretty sizable. And let's say it's less than that. Let's say it's only 5%. That's still sizable when you consider the amount of water that we use in agriculture. And so that's something I think that we need to consider. If you go additionally, so if you go above that, if you're trying to get to 20 or 30%, we may have to start talking about paying people not to farm. There's two ways to do that. In the Colorado system, one of the ways they've done that is they've actually paid people to fallow. That has been extraordinarily unpopular in Utah. And so the law was changed a couple of years ago to allow for something called split season leasing, to where you can grow your first 2 cuts of hay, and then you get paid for the last 2 cuts not to water that hay. And that's something that I think that we'll start rolling out and see if we can get some more water savings in that front. Water banking and leasing, similarly, you can set up what they call water banks. Then you can serve water through optimization or otherwise. You bank and hold that, and then you can shepherd that either to the Great Salt Lake or to areas that might need it to facilitate new uses in municipal settings. And so that's something I think that we should take a look at as well. None of these things is free. None of these things is easy. And all of these things are going to get you yelled at. Sorry. I wish there were an easier way.
We're already being yelled at.
Well, good. But that's just the nature of it. And I think that you just got to be aware that that's the conversation. I know, and just to get into the questions and answers, I know that there's real concern about, hey, the state's going to come in and make sure that we don't grow. I don't think that's the intent of the state. I will say, and coming from a resident of the Valley and someone that very much wants my kids to live here, we have to take seriously the relationship we have with water. And that relationship that we have with water, we have to take into consideration things like the Great Salt Lake. And things like other uses, because otherwise I think that we're going to be in a regulatory system that none of us can live with very well. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
One question I have, Brian, that always pops into my head. We talk about reducing agricultural usage, and there are technological means of doing that. But to say, okay, we're going to pay a farmer not to farm,
Who else signed up?
I mean, what are we going to eat then?
I think it's a really good point. And that's why I say I would prefer very much for split season leasing to where we do have crop production as well. But I think it's something that, again, it's not a silver bullet. I wish that it were. I mean, I honestly wish that there was some big pot of free water out there. I actually have been lobbied to go out and get water from the Yellowstone River and just bring it down. From an engineering standpoint, not hard to do. From a political standpoint, impossible to do. Right? And so you look at that and just be aware that we're going to make those kind of hard choices. And I wish that it was easier, because on one side we say we should have local food production. On the other side, we say, well, gosh, we may want to limit how much ag uses. That being said, one of the things we're going to look at really strongly at Utah State is different crops. Right now, a lot of our crops are alfalfa. That's grown because it's really effective to grow here. You can make a profit off of it. For many years, we have not been looking at things like wheat, which actually may use less water, or other substitutes where you could actually grow more local food for less water. If we're able to do that, then I think that we may, from a government standpoint, encourage that type of transition as well. Sure.
I have a question.
You're going to come at me, I can tell. You've got the skeptical look, and you've got...
He's not presented anything that's fun or happy here today. So.
Well, that's why they call me Dr. Doom. So,
I'm sitting here saying, because the State Water Rights Division, we had meetings with them and everything else. From a personal standpoint, I'm a farmer too. And the very first meeting they had here where they talked about that, they kept saying that they had advertised it, yet I came here and I think there were 13 citizens at that meeting. I don't think, and I'm sitting here saying that they took a stronger stand than what the governor had came out on that. Every time I sit and listen to something, agricultural is the top user. And so we talked about, I mean, I'm using water from the Hiram Lake Dam. We're being told now that we're going to pipe that at a substantial cost. Mm-hmm. So no matter what we talk about here for water, there's going to be a cost. The engineers who were doing that are saying that's going to be a 33% savings of water just for those farmers. And so to me, the farmers already took a point of doing some cost and reducing that. But it didn't seem like the State Water Rights Division listened or gave us any credit for that. Mm-hmm. Still saying it's going to be a closed county. And I'm wondering, and that's why we asked the legislatures to come in and talk about that as well. And so that's one of my concerns. The other concern is okay, I get it, we got to do something about the water, but if you're a citizen right now and you go out and try to find water rights to buy, because if the state's going to close that, I asked the state, well, then they ought to help in doing those water rights, because as a citizen, you can go buy water rights and you might buy a piece of crap and you have no idea. Right. So yes, there needs to be some things that are done in that. And then my other question is I heard, I actually traveled to Aruba. The whole island of Aruba does desalinization plant. As a country, are we looking at that more? I actually Googled desalinization plants for California, and the thing they told me was costs is too high. Well, flip, we're all going to be talking about costs are too high. So I also heard pipe water from the sea into Salt Lake. I mean, all of these things we're talking costs, but to get down and say, okay, are we really looking at that and what's going on? Those are the points make it.
So I'm going to take those in reverse order. Okay, I'm going to start with the last. In terms of piping, I think it's something that will always be on the table. The question is, how much are we willing to pay for it? And when you look at, and when you look at something like a pipeline to the ocean, just as a for instance, doing the rough math, you probably are at a $15 billion just for the infrastructure. To run it, for the electricity to pump water up and then down, you're probably looking at maybe.
So it's actually been considered or studied then.
Oh yeah, and
heavily.
And I think that it's something that you've got to evaluate. I don't think we're there yet to where the cost and benefits pencil, right? And I think that's why the state has so focused on conservation, because it's a cheaper way to save water than bringing in that new water from other places. In terms of desal, I happen to make the terrible life choice of doing my PhD dissertation on water governance in Southern California, which I would not recommend to anybody. And if you're ever having trouble sleeping, I'm happy to send you my dissertation. I refer to it as verbal narcolepsy. It's spectacular. I would say this, desal is alive and well, but it is also faced a lot of the same concerns. It is costly, it is. And there are certain costs that, well, some have been willing to bear and others have not. The Orange County plant that was just put in, people decided, well, it was the California Coastal Commission decided that if you're desaling the water, what do you do with all that salt? And the solution was, well, we'll just put it out to sea, which every other country pretty much does. I mean, if I went to Israel earlier this year, and that's what they do with their salt stream, is they just put it out further in the ocean, and they claim to have no adverse consequences. The California Coastal Commission said, no, we don't think so. We think it's going to have a negative impact on marine biology, and therefore you probably can't have your desal plant. Again, we're going to have to get through those type of conversations because it's going to get harder, not easier. I mean, I hope we have winters like last year, every single year for the rest of forever. That would make my life so much easier. I'm going to retire in 3 years and say, mission accomplished, or it's all done. But I don't see that happening, and so I think that we got to be careful. Now, back to the Division of Water Rights, I wish I would have been here to that meeting to hear what was proposed. And I've tried to call the state engineer since talking to Micah last night about kind of what was proposed, and I don't have a very good answer. What I would say, though, is this. Cache Valley is very water rich. You got to be aware of that. When you look at the amount of water that we have allocated, the entirety of the Colorado that we're fighting over, spending millions of dollars fighting over, we're talking that at maximum is 1.4 million acre feet. In Cache Valley alone, you have 1.5 million acre feet currently approved. That's a lot of water. So, and I'm not saying that we're misusing it, because I used to go out and irrigate my dad's plot in River Heights, and as an 8-year-old with a shovel and a canvas dam, that's kind of a religious experience. We dropped off and say, make sure it all gets wet, right? And you look at that, and that's my heritage, right? And I can't claim to be a farmer because that's the one bit of farming I got to do. My dad grew up on a dairy farm, and then he became an electrical engineer. But nonetheless, that's who I am. That's the Cache Valley that I came back to, and I love, and I don't want to say you can't do that, but what I am saying is we're going to have to consider that activity as the totality of the experiences we want to have here. And if we want to have both growth and have more people living here, as well as ag, something's going to have to give in that. And I wish I could come in and say you're going to have a bunch more water rights. I don't know your situation, but I would say that if I'm looking at Utah writ large, we're seeing, generally speaking, a hotter and drier place. And as a hotter and drier place, we end up with less groundwater and less things. I really am super happy today, aren't I? So you're screwed, I guess, what I'm saying. No.
Now, another question. Does the West or Utah do the right way in our sewer treatment and wastewater?
I think it's hard. It depends on where you are.
Because you go back to Chicago and other places, and recycle meets a whole new means there.
So in areas where you don't have, okay, so in the Great Salt Lake Basin, it's complicated. 92% of the water that makes it into a pipe makes it into the Great Salt Lake eventually. Do you know that?
I have no idea.
It's pretty closed, right? 92%. So if it gets into a pipe, it'll get there. So a lot of your effluent right now, well, the Jordan River is essentially entirely effluent by the time it reaches Gilbert Bay. People just don't consider that. If you shut that off, you put it all into recycled, you actually lose a big source of water into the Great Salt Lake. And so something that, as commissioner, I'll be looking at is going out and actually purchasing water rights out of waste treatment plants so that we're able to get that water to the lake. That's the case there. So in the basin, in the Great Salt Lake Basin, I'd say we have to balance those equities between what we get to the lake and what people are using. In places like St. George, this is a complete no-brainer. We should recycle every drop of water. We should do that, and right now they are completely transitioning from what has been a wholly reliant system on the Virgin River to where they're now considering more recycling plants. It's, again, very expensive, and they're not even talking toilet to tap, which is kind of a gross term. They're talking recycling it, right, and then using that on your external water sources that you're going to be using water for anyway. And so that's what the sort of things they're starting to do, and I think you'll see more of that in areas like that to where it makes sense. So anything on the Colorado, I would say let's recycle all day long. On the Great Salt Lake system, we're going to have to carefully weigh those things out.
Okay,
Does that make sense?
Question. Yes, it does. Another thing from the meeting with the Division of Water Rights is they referred to the Old West water law, and that they actually had letters addressed and stamped to send out to people saying your water rights are, I guess, shut off. And my question was, it seemed like they were only picking on the county residents and not the municipality. And When you get to Old West water law, I really want to make sure we're studying that because it seemed, and the question was asked, are we turning off some county residents, but we're gonna let some municipal residents still water their lawn or have golf courses? Those are things that I think need big, deep discussions because
Totally
I'm
agree.
like, that seems silly from a Old West water stance.
Totally agree. And I think that it's something we're still trying to get our heads around. I mean, the Old West water law, you had two legs of this. One, first in time, first in right. And second, to make sure that you're using that water, you have a beneficial use clause, right? You say you need to put it to beneficial use. Oftentimes when it gets into a municipal system, we actually assume it's in a beneficial use, right? And we don't go back to evaluate how that's being used in the municipal system. And so that's something I think that we probably ought to be looking at. Secondly, in terms of just the equities, last year when we were looking at real drought, I mean, you have no idea. I was at DNR at the time, and it was really interesting because we had the Weaver Basin Water Conservancy District that had mandated no more than watering 1 day a week and all sorts of stuff because they were in a world of hurt. They didn't get this is 2022 again, they didn't get hardly any water. And they were right next to the Central Utah Water Conservancy District. In Central Utah, you had kids running through the sprinklers, right? On the middle of the day, and you've got people with brown lawns and, paying exorbitant fees, and then across the street, different water. There doesn't seem something fair about that, and I think it's something as a state we really need to start talking about.
Is the state willing to look at that?
We are,
I mean,
yeah.
'cause it didn't seem like the Division of Water Rights listened very much to that. It was like, yeah, we're sending these out, and the others were there, and I'm like,
It is something the state's looking at. I don't know if it's Division of Water Rights that's doing that, but it's something that I've been meetings about and will be certainly considering because there is an equity issue there.
My question is, looking at the Great Salt Lake, percentage of state-owned, percentage federal-owned, percentage, how does that all fit that footprint there of the lake and,
So the lake itself,
and, all those, areas around it?
it gets complicated. Let me do my
I
best.
guess why I bring that up is that, sometimes we make enemies in Washington.
Mhm.
And they come out and they end up doing something to kind of get back at you.
Oh, yeah.
And you see something like that happening in that footprint?
So,
So all of a sudden, these couple birds, and these other things, literally shut down a lot of our economic viability because of a, I don't know how to say it nice. A politician out there uses the Antiquities Act or something like that against you?
so potentially. I mean, I think that I went to the ESA and the Clean Air Act because I think those are the two most likely to be utilized. And I think that, yeah, that's totally within the realm of the possible, and it's something that I think that we all, as people that work in the policy space, have to be aware of and have to guard against. That's because ultimately, if that happens, then we are no different than the Klamath. And we've got the federal regulators deciding how much water goes where. I think that we as a state should avoid that at all costs because we should be in charge of our own futures. So that's one. In terms of the ownership of the lake itself, it gets complicated because law is complicated. Here's my best. You ready for this? At the area where the lake was navigable at time of statehood, they call that the high water mark, and that's been adjudicated around most of the lake. Everything under that high water mark, or at the time of statehood, is considered the sovereign lands of the state of Utah. Okay? So the sovereign lands of the state of Utah, so the lake itself, the bed of the lake is managed by the state. The feds could not come in and use the Antiquities Act on that because it is owned by the state, controlled by the state, managed by the state. The water itself that's in the lake is also property of the state of Utah. That being said, that again, if we get into those characterizations of whether it's an endangered species or whether it's some other regulatory mechanism, there's the potential for those priority rights to be reorganized for the highest beneficial use, which in that case would be the eared grebe or the Wilson's phalarope. And that would mean every farmer, every municipality would potentially have to take a large cut in order to save that. And that's something I think that we just got to be mindful of. And even though the lake is completely state property and completely within the state of Utah, it is still managed by the feds. In that sense, when it becomes to an endangered species.
Go back a little bit further. You went to Israel
Yep.
not very long ago, and there was quite a group that went back there. Now, when Casey Snyder, I think he was one of them, he went back
was.
there.
Yep.
In looking at that, when they look at water optimization, every drop, every use, every irrigation needs, what are they looking at it for production? Are they looking at it for just home use? Are they looking at everything across the board?
I would say everything across the board, but I would say that they have taken a strong preference as water for people, right? When you talk about the Dead Sea, which they have their own
Right.
big saline lake, they're less concerned about that, but they don't have the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Air Act to worry about. And one more thing, when you talk about Israel, it is the federal government in Israel, right? The federal government is the government. Rather than having our states and our federalized system. So
And the other thing is the relationship with Idaho, Wyoming. Is that,
perfect.
well, I'm sure, but I mean, that's always,
It's okay. So
just welcome to Bear Lake.
similar to the Colorado, the Bear River went to a compact where all the states decided how much water they should use. Right now, the states of Wyoming and Idaho don't care as much as they should about the Great Salt Lake. We are working very hard to make sure they understand the regulatory picture. Because if there were a listing, the feds don't care if it's in Idaho or if it's in Wyoming.
That's what I would.
It's gonna be the exact same thing, and so there ought to be that spirit of shared sacrifice. So that's the.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry to bring the light and joy to the meeting. I'm happy to come back anytime, give you reports. I'm required to give a report to the legislatures as the commissioner in the last part of November. I'm happy to come back and talk to you all about what that report says and what we're looking for. We're very much looking for a collaborative solution.
We also want to know, we appreciate you being open to work and educate and help us, but also work with the conservation, or with the Cashwater District.
Well, I'm not going to work with them.
No, we'll throw a flag, right?
Yeah. No.
Make sure that there is open dialogue. They're one of our biggest speaking voices
Totally agree.
for water up here, and we put that together to make sure that they wouldn't, and, he has a lot of clout.
A lot of cloud.
No, but they also they don't want to rule everything. We just want to all work together somehow.
No, I'm happy to work with whomever you'd like, and ultimately, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And I can say that with a much more meaning because I choose to live here. This is where I want to live and raise my family because I love it. So.
But always strengthen your relationship and respect for agriculture.
I agree. It's important, right?
It is.
I agree. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.